Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. My name is James Jacob Prasch from Moriel Ministries, coming to you here with our midweek Moriel Bible study. I'm in the United States at the moment. At the specific moment, I'm in Southwest Montana. We've been at meetings and so forth in California, in Wisconsin, and we've traveled through Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, and now we're in Montana. We have forthcoming meetings that are listed on the Moriel website, also coming up next month in New York City on the 14th at Church of the Open Door, 7 p.m., which is in East Greenwich Village on 3rd Avenue and 7th Street. And also in Baltimore on the 15th at 3 p.m. Those details are on the Moriel website. Also, in Great Britain, on the 17th and 19th, we have the Moriel Conference. Beryl did manage to get more rooms as we sold out, filled up, but the rooms that she managed to get in addition are also gone now. So we had hoped to keep bookings open until the 1st of October, but we ran out of rooms, and when we acquired more rooms, we ran out of those. There may be one or two. You can give Beryl a try if you want to through the Moriel website, but basically the conference in the UK, the English Welsh conference from the 17th to the 19th are filled up. Before that, however, and the first weekend in November, I'm due to be in Belfast, first in Newton Abbey with Pastor Stephen Tremble. That will be in Newton Abbey at Calvary Pentecostal Church. That will be on the 2nd. I'll be with Pastor Marty Foster at Orangefield Crescent in East Belfast on the 3rd to the 5th. The 3rd to the 5th of November. Those times will be posted on the Moriel website, or are posted. I shall also be in County Boyle. Instead of Donegal this time, we'll be in County Boyle in the Republic of Ireland on the 6th. On the 6th, those details have not been posted yet, but the date is fixed. But the meeting location and the time will be posted very shortly. So the conference is pretty much filled up for England and Wales. We will have further dates in the United States posted on the website, most significantly the 14th and 15th. I'll be in other places in America, such as Tennessee and so forth, but the concluding dates will be in New York City and in Baltimore. Then back to Britain, but before the British conference, we shall be in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and in the Republic of Ireland, all on the Moriel.org website. Enough of that. Let's move on to our subject tonight. We're up to Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21 will begin in the first verse. Read with me, please, if you will, from verses 1 through 11. Now, these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he's the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I'll not go out as a free man, then his master shall bring him to God. Then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, He may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without any payment of money. Let's just look at this a little bit closer. If a man, if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master. He shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and children, I will not go out as a free man. Well, we have multiple aspects of the Torah. The two most important aspects of the Torah are the sacrificial. The sacrificial goes hand in hand with the festal, the Hebrew feasts. And this deals with the Levitical sacrificial system, foreshadowing the death and resurrection and the atonement bought by the Messiah and other things derivative from and associated with it. But we also have the juridical content. The Torah was the Constitution, and it was the legal code for the Jewish people, that is, at that time, the Israelite people in their own nation, for the Hebrews. This was their body of law. As we looked at last week, there were 613 commandments, but 603 were based on the 10. The Decalogue is the basis. The rest derive directly or indirectly from that. These are the ordinances. Well, it says, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not bear false witness. But now we get into specific statute. Remember, Israel was a theocratic state. Now, in Protestant democracies, it was always believed, beginning with Great Britain and the United States, that man's laws must be based on God's laws, that the body of law in constitutional democracies and in parliamentary democracies must derive from Judeo-Christian biblical principles. Man's laws have their validity because they come from God's laws. When man's laws fail to come from God's laws or contradict it, that is when we come into conflict. And that is what we have today, a conflict between man's laws and God's laws, but that's a separate subject. Even people who were deists, who were not born-again Christians, but accepted the moral value of the Judeo-Christian scriptures, such as Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson gave Bibles and New Testaments to North American Indians, to the indigenous peoples. He understood the importance of it, and it was understood by both the founding fathers of America and, of course, the Puritan fathers of Britain, that democracy could only work if it was based on these principles. But these principles are first found in the Torah, and we're reading those juridical principles now. It is interesting that the first one that takes place is something that has existed since almost the dawn of man. The issue of slavery. Now, by way of clarification, you have a linguistic problem. The Hebrew word for slave is the same as the Hebrew word for bondservant. That is aved. The Israelites were slaves, avadim, in Egypt. But in the Torah, they were bondservants. They were indentured. God did not allow slavery. More of that in a moment. Also, in Greek, the word is doulos. There's a problem. The Greeks and Hebrews had two different concepts of slavery, but linguistically, it's complicated because it's the same word for servant, slave, and bondslave or bondservant. It's all the same term in both Greek and in Hebrew. It is the content of the scripture that allows us to differentiate. But in the age in which we live, we have people propagating a woke agenda that has infiltrated the church. I'm going to speak about how slavery in the Western world, particularly the United States, did not follow the Hebraic concept, model, legislation governing bondservantship, but followed the pagan Greco-Roman one, yet pretended it to be Christian. I'm going to address this wrong theology that was adopted by Southern Methodists, Southern Baptists, and others to try to justify the institution of slavery as it was practiced in the American South prior to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War back in the mid-19th century. Now we're talking of something well over 150 years ago. There are no descendants of the slaves now that had a parent, a grandparent, or really even a great-grandparent. There's nobody now who is a descendant of slaves except in multiple generations. Their parents were not slaves, their grandparents were not slaves, their great-grandparents were not slaves. There were other injustices such as Jim Crow, but not slavery. Let's look. What you have today, people getting into the church, trying to propagate an agenda that is politically, not theologically or spiritually motivated. Now, a number of Black intellectuals who are honest and who have Christian leanings, they may be Christians, have spoken of this and have told the truth about it. Certainly Candace Owen, a brilliant woman, has. Dr. Thomas Sowell certainly has. Larry Elder has. There have been a number of Blacks and Black Christian pastors who have told the truth. But there are others who are not telling the truth. Now, it is not my purpose to editorialize politically. I'm simply going to state certain facts. I want to show how the scriptures were distorted and misapplied in the American South during the age of slavery. But I do not want that to be in any way confused with or equated with the present woke agenda and those who are trying to import it into the body of Christ. Let's begin at the beginning. Slavery. Slavery in Africa was not begun by white people. Slavery in Africa was begun by Black people. And there were people called Barbary pirates. The first military conflict the United States had outside of the United States was with the Barbary pirates of North Africa, who were seizing American ships as well as European ships and taking people as slaves. These were Muslims. These were North African Muslims. Okay. You had Muslims from Turkey, from the Ottoman Empire. You had Muslims from the Barbary coast of North Africa engaging in the enslavement of white people. The idea that only white people enslaved Africans is false. Africans enslaved white people. Africans enslaved each other. The slaves that were bought to the United States and transatlantic to Brazil and to the West Indies were already slaves. They were sold to European, mainly British and French slave traders by tribal chiefs and village chiefs. Sometimes it was their own people from their own tribe. Very often it was people from rival tribes who they captured, but they were already slaves. No Caucasian ever went out to Africa, into the bush or the jungle and abducted Black people. That's not what happened. It never happened. These people who were bought across the Atlantic on slave ships were already slaves owned by Black African slaves. They were purchased, often for cheap goods and for liquor, rum, whatever, sometimes money, but they were already slaves. And a very cheap price was a value was affixed to them by their native African owners who were tribal chiefs and village chiefs. That is the truth of it. Now, there were two slave trades in sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel and below. There was the East African trade and the West African trade. The bigger of the two was by far the East African trade. It is where Islamic countries, Arab countries, bought Black African slaves from East Africa up to the Middle East and to North Africa. The common practice was emasculation. They would castrate the males. Hence, because the slaves had no capacity to reproduce in captivity, the demand for more and more slaves mushroomed. Thus, the East African slave trade was bigger than the West African slave trade, which saw the slaves come to mainly Brazil, the Caribbean, and the southern United States, or what would become later the southern United States. Then it was the colonies. Okay, so East Africa was a lot better. The West African slave trade, carried out by the British and French, was abolished. It was abolished in the British Empire, quickly followed by the French in the early 1800s. Within 30 years, there was emancipation, followed by a constitutional amendment after the Civil War, abolishing it in the southern United States. Remember, as Candace Owen and others have said, white Europeans did not begin slavery in Africa. They ended it. They ended it. It was white Europeans who ended slavery. They did not begin it. Now let's look at the East African slavery. When did that end? Well, it hasn't. You can go on the website of Slavery International. Chad, Mauritania, Niger. It's happened in Sudan. There are Black African slaves owned by wealthy Muslims to this day. It has not yet been abolished. In the Muslim world. It was only abolished in the Judeo-Christian world. It still goes on. Yet, the woke people are up in arms about what happened, something that ended over 150 years ago, and talking about compensation as if they're a victim of something that happened before their grandparents were born. But say nothing about the enslavement of Black people, including Black children, still going on in Islamic countries. That is hypocritical in itself. I'm reminded of Muhammad Ali, the boxer. I saw him once. His original name was Cassius Clay from Kentucky. Many Black families in Kentucky named their sons Cassius, not after the famous Roman politician, but after an abolitionist in Kentucky, the leader of the abolitionist movement in Kentucky, who crusaded against slavery and campaigned for the freedom of slaves in Kentucky. And so many Black families named their sons Cassius, much the same as many Mennonites named their daughters Catherine after Catherine the Great, for giving them refuge from the persecution of Catholics and Protestants alike. That was just the way they did it. The Mennonites honored Catherine the Great. the Black American community of Kentucky honored this gentleman whose name was Cassius. Yet, Cassius Clay becomes Muhammad Ali. He said Cassius is a white person's name. He wants a black Muslim name, ignoring the fact that to this day, Black Islamic nations have black slaves. And according to the Hadith, Muhammad owned black slaves. Muhammad referred to black Africans as raisin heads, according to the Hadith. They don't tell you this because it's not about history or about truth. It's not about justice. It's about political manipulation. Why should people be concerned about something that was abolished 150 years ago, given the fact that it's still going on? They're up in arms about something that happened in the southern United States. And there's been one lie after another. Since 1619, America was founded on slavery. First of all, it was only the southern states. More Americans were killed in the Civil War than in World War I or World War II. Far more. Far more. Find me a black African country that had a civil war to end slavery. You won't find one. The casualty figures at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and Antietam, Maryland, they're astounding even by modern standards. Tens of thousands in one battle. It was only the southern states. And not all Southerners owned slaves, and some did not even approve of it. But that is not the narrative. The United States became an industrial power and a major economic power on the global scale because of industrialization. That did not take place in the South. The South was largely agricultural. The Industrial Revolution that began in England took root in the United States in the Northeast and the Midwest. A black slave had capital value. A black slave was worth a couple of $1,000s. You didn't want to lose a slave. But an Irishman or a Chinaman, they had no value. Get the Irish to dig in the coal mines. Get the Irish to work in the sweatshops. Get the Chinese to do the blasting in the Sierra Madre Mountains in California for the railroads. Who cares if a Chinaman gets killed or an Irishman gets killed? They have no cash value, but a black did. America became a major economic power because of industrialization, and the exploitation was largely against Irish and Chinese in the West. Later, Italians and others, but certainly in the 19th century, the plight of the blacks in the South was slavery. The plight of the Shanty Irish, as they were called in the northern states and in the Midwest, was Irish. In the West, it was Chinese. They had no capital value. They didn't care. When the canals were dug in New Orleans, there was a lot of landslides, and a lot of people drowned and were killed. But they didn't use black slaves to dig those canals. They brought Irishmen from up north because nobody cared if they died. The Irish were mistreated in Britain. They came to America and were mistreated again. The same kinds of things that happened. You have the slaughter of black regiments in the Union Army. They'd send the blacks in first very often, and they would be decimated by the Confederates. High casualties. Well, it was the same with the Irish. They had Irish brigades. The unbelievable slaughter of the Irish in Fredericksburg, Virginia in the Civil War. They were Irish. They don't tell you the whole story. It was not only the blacks who were the victims of this kind of injustice at that time. And there were only 11 Confederate states. You did have border states that had some slaves, Maryland and Kentucky, and there was efforts to make Kansas and Nebraska into slave states but those were resisted, as they were resisted in Missouri. You had fights between partisans, pro-slavery and anti-slavery in Missouri, Quantrill's Rangers and things like this. People fought to stop slavery from coming north and expanding west. Many white people died to stop the expansion of slavery west of the Mississippi. And many, many more died preserving the Union, because the Union was split over the issue of slavery. That is why secession came to the American South. When Lincoln was elected, he was abolitionist. This idea of the 1690 is a pack of lies. It is historical revisionism. It's not what really happened. Additionally, you had a strong evangelical Christian, for want of a better term, opposition. While the Calvinists of the American South were pro-slavery, the Wesleyan Arminians of the North were anti-slavery, but so were New England Calvinists. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a descendant of the Puritans, of the Pilgrims, her father a Reformed preacher, minister, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. That infuriated people throughout the northern United States, both the book and the play, because the prose of the book was easily adoptable for stage. And this motivated people strongly against slavery. They were already against it, but seeing Uncle Tom's Cabin, it just drove people to the point of being willing to do anything to get rid of slavery. There were people in the South, some of them very radical, such as John Brown, who were strongly anti-slavery. They organized underground railroads. Southerners who were against slavery, organizing what were known as underground railroads to get runaway slaves across the Potomac River and across the Ohio River into non-slave states. It was only the American South, and only 40% of Southerners owned slaves. Only 40%. Now, that's still a lot. The slave population grew to about 3.9 million at one point, but it was not what the woke people tell us. Christians should not believe these things. Christians should believe the truth. Saved, Bible-believing Christians were at the forefront of abolitionism. That began in England with William Wilberforce, with the Earl of Shaftesbury. It began with John Newton, who composed Amazing Grace, and it spread to the United States. Christians were at the forefront of getting rid of slavery. This is the truth. This is what really happened. You did not find the original leaders in the Black community who were at the forefront of opposing slavery as being in any way hostile to whites. They were aligned with them. I think of Harriet Tubman, a Bible-believing Christian. She was a saved Bible-believing Christian. Absolutely that. Later, Booker T. Washington, obviously, Frederick Douglass. These people were not anti-white. They did not blame all white people for what happened. When Frederick Douglass went to Ireland, he understood what was happening to the Irish is what happened to the blacks. And he gave speeches in Ireland to that effect. It was very, very different then. Until the time of Martin Luther King. After the time of Martin Luther King, it became something racist. I don't just mean white racist. I just don't mean the Klan. I mean a reactionary black racist. But Stephen Douglas, George Washington Carver, the great scientist, founder of modern food science, Booker T. Washington, the great educator, none of these people, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, certainly Harriet Tubman, certainly Stephen Douglas, Frederick Douglass, none of these people were racist. None of them blamed all white people. They understood it was a economically motivated phenomena of the American South. Now let's go back to the transatlantic slave trade from West Africa, from places like Nigeria. Let's look at it. Most of those slaves were brought to Brazil or to the West Indies by the British and French. Most went to South America or the West Indies. Of all of the blacks sold outside of Africa, of all of the blacks sold as slaves, they were already slaves, but sold as slaves outside of Africa, only 6% came to the southern United States. 6%. Where was the other 94%? Go look in Black Africa. Look at the Islamic countries of Africa. Look at Niger. Look at Chad. Look at Mauritania. They're still there. And they needed more and more because they emasculated them. They couldn't reproduce, as opposed to what happened in the West Indies, South America, and the southern United States. They were not emasculated. They were bred in captivity, as it were. Some of these religious pretenses that have come about have been absurd. One of which was Rastafarianism, where smoking ganja was seen as a sacrament. And Haile Selassie was seen as the Christ. Now, his own family denies this. He was a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has a combination of ancient Judaism and Christianity. It blends ancient Judaism. They have replicas of the Arks of the Covenant, even, with Coptic Christianity. This was the religion of Haile Selassie. His own family testifies to that. He did not claim to be Jesus. And he did not advocate smoking cannabis. But the whole reggae music and all this stuff, this was the religion. With the dreadlocks. Most of the Rastas who came to Ethiopia returned back to Britain and America. They couldn't take the African lifestyle. Life was too difficult. They were better off living in the West Indies or in London, England, or somewhere where they came from. They said the experience of the blacks in the United States and in the Caribbean, particularly the Caribbean, was the Babylonian captivity. I remember I had Rasta friends, and before I was a walk with the Lord, we'd be smoking joints, smoking cannabis, and if they saw the cops, they'd say, "Here come the Babylon, here come the Babylon." That was the Babylon. There was the Babylonian captivity to them. Well, the reggae music, Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and all this stuff, it had a religious significance. It was a religion of Black liberation. It was founded by somebody in New York, of all places, Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was not an educated man, and he did something that was ridiculous. To anyone who's read the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, they realize it is a strongly Christian-influenced book. Uncle Tom was not an Uncle Tom. He was flogged to death by Simone Legree for not disclosing the hiding place of runaway Black slaves. Uncle Tom was not an Uncle Tom. The blacks who collaborated with the white establishment was called Sambo Tom, not Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom was not an Uncle Tom. But Black Americans used the term Uncle Tom, denigrating Black Americans who see through the myth and the nonsense and the political manipulation of them. Not knowing that Uncle Tom was not an Uncle Tom, too ignorant to know how they're even using the term. No, it's a Sambo was the one who did that, not Uncle Tom. This is a crazy religion. Another is the Nation of Islam. It was founded by Elijah B. Muhammad, who was held in the black community as the murderer of Malcolm X. It was Malcolm X who put the Nation of Islam on the board. But Malcolm X went to the Hajj into Saudi Arabia, and he found out that the teachings of Elijah bin Muhammad were nonsense, as well as the corruption that he cited with women and finance and things like this within the Nation of Islam. And he was murdered in New Amsterdam Hall in Manhattan, in New York. Another religion based on this thing, ignoring the fact that Muhammad owned slaves, ignoring the fact that slavery of blacks exists to this day, not in Christian countries, but in Muslim countries. Unbelievable. Well, when the Rastas got into a false religion, that's one thing. When the Nation of Islam, Farrakhan's people, get into a false religion, that's one thing. When people claiming to be born-again Christians begin buying into this garbage, that's something very, very different. It is revisionist. It is predicated upon bigotry and ignorance. Tens of thousands of white people from the northern states died in civil war in Fredericksburg, in Gettysburg, in Antietam. You should read the casualty statistics. They're bigger than the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. They're bigger than D-Day. And the population was much smaller then. It was a much higher percentage of population. And there were no veterans benefits. You got your leg blown off, that's your problem. You left blind, that was your problem. There was no pension and things in the sense we have now for those who survived it. And the post-operative gangrene after the amputations, it was unbelievable. Yet there's some kind of a blame to be assigned to all white people when most white people were against it. The population of the northern Midwestern states, New England states, were far bigger than the South. That's one of the reasons the Union won. But let's look at this even further. Oh, look at the plight of black people in America and how disadvantaged they are. That's what we're being told. And this is supposedly the collective fault of white people. White racism, systemic racism. Well, before civil rights, before the early 1960s, people don't realize how bad it was. I remember driving to Florida with my parents through the Jim Crow South when I was a kid. And I remember restaurants, white only, billboards, this is Klan country. And I remember black people living in huts with no running water or electricity in the United States. 80% of American blacks live below the poverty line. Today, only 20% of American blacks live below the poverty line. The things driving black poverty now are absentee fatherhood and a school system designed to fail, but I digress. To blame systemic racism for a moral breakdown? There is a moral breakdown of society that affects all races in the Western world. It is not peculiar to blacks, but it has affected the blacks most. It was warned about by a Kennedy Democrat, Daniel Moynihan, in the 1960s. He said it would come to this because of the breakdown of the family and absentee fatherhood. And it happened, and he was a Democrat. But it's much easier to believe a lie than to tell the truth. Well, I don't want to get into the politics of it too much. I just want to look at certain facts. You will not find a country in post-colonial Africa where the people, the black people, were not economically better off under the British or the French in terms of longevity, infant mortality, unemployment, standard of living. All those things were better under colonialism, and I don't like colonialism. Everybody in my family, the Catholics, the Jews, the Americans, they all fought the British for independence. I don't like colonialism unless it's a thing like Puerto Rico, where most people want it because they see it as to their advantage economically and so forth. Unless the people want it, I don't agree with it. But you can't blame white people for what's happened in post-colonial Africa. There is a country that was once a French colony. That country is the poorest country in the world, probably by most estimates. Probably the poorest country in the world. It's called Haiti. They overthrew the French in the 1700s. They have been an independent black country for over 200 years. Find me a Haitian who doesn't want to come to Georgia or Chicago or Texas or anywhere. They only tell the side of the story they want to tell you. Well, let's go back to the history some more. Very few. I'm not saying there weren't some, there were some. Let's say few. Few blacks were ever brought to the United States as slaves. They were brought to British colonies as slaves. They were brought to French colonies via New Orleans before the Louisiana Purchase as slaves. But the United States declared its independence from Britain in 1776, July 4th. But it was simply independent colonies held together in an economic mess and in a political mess, held together by something called the Articles of Confederation. Not until 1787 did the United States come into existence as a constitutional democracy, a constitutional republic. That happened in 1787. The United States became a constitutional republic. It really came into its existence as a nation, formally speaking, in 1787. Slaves were still being brought to the United States. But by 1800, the United States banned American slave traders from trading in slaves. They would not allow American flag ships to bring slaves into the United States anymore. You couldn't bring them into New Orleans or into Charleston, South Carolina, the main ports of the slave trade. You couldn't do it. The British banned it in Bristol, which was the main port of slave trade in England, the transit point, but the United States banned it in 1800. By 1808, the American Navy was patrolling the coast of Africa, including the USS Constitution, which you can still board as a museum in Boston. They would not allow any nation to bring slaves to the New World. The British Navy likewise began patrolling the coast of Africa after the British Empire abolished slavery. White people ended it. So long before the Civil War, the United States would not allow the slave trade. The slaves in the United States were born there. They were bred in captivity. But at a very early point, supported by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were benevolent slave owners in the American South themselves, and championed by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and then President James Monroe, the United States began doing something. They began sending free slaves to the Cerebral Islands and to what is today the area around Senegal. That didn't last too long. And Sierra Leone. That didn't last too long. soon after, funded by the United States. The United States acquired a nominal colony, which they turned into a commonwealth. And then, once it was established, they gave it its independence. That was the nation Liberia. Founded on strong Christian principles, the capital, Monrovia, later named after James Monroe, had originally been called Christopolis. Polis is a city in Greek, Christ City. It was founded on strong Christian principles. The capital city was named after Christ. Its constitution was written by a Jewish believer in Jesus, a famous legate and justice in the state Supreme Court in Maine, and he was the primary founder of Harvard Law School, a Jewish believer in Jesus, Simon Greenleaf, who became a believer in Jesus by trying to disprove the Bible with legal argumentation. He tried to disprove the messiahship of Jesus. Now, Simon Greenleaf wrote a compendium called The Rules of Evidence, still in use this day in criminal jurisprudence, the Rules of Evidence. It's still in use to this day, and extrapolated from it are many other statutes in evidential law. He wrote the Constitution of Liberia, a Jewish Christian. At the same time, another Jewish Christian in Great Britain opposed slavery. He would later become prime minister, but under Lord Derby, when Derby was prime minister, he was the chancellor of the exchequer. That's like the secretary of the treasury. His name was Benjamin Disraeli, another Jewish Christian, an opponent of slavery, who was the political rival and nemesis of William Gladstone, who nominally professed to be opposed to slavery, but did not approve of the American Civil War to abolish it. His father was the largest white slave owner in the West Indies. So you had two Jewish Christians instrumental in the abolition of slavery. One was Disraeli, and the other was Simon Greenleaf. This is what happened. The United States Navy would intercept ships bringing slaves across the Atlantic way before the Civil War, liberate the slaves on them, seize them as cargo, liberate them, and bring them to Liberia and set them free. At least they'd be in Africa. This is way before the Civil War now. So the United States outlawed the slave trade well before the Civil War. When the Civil War came, the United States abolished it not long after French. There was only a short period in American history at the very beginning when the United States engaged in the slave trade, and it didn't take long to outlaw it. This is what really happened. It was only in the South. They've never told the truth. They're lying. Now, we've said that. I can prove everything I've said. And there are Black scholars and Black Christians who will tell you the same or similar, factually identical or close to it to what I've said. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. The right to enslave Blacks came about by appealing theologically, something we've pointed out before, to Genesis chapter 9, verse 25. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers. He was from the descendants of Noah, son Ham. Ham means hot or heat. They went to the hotter countries, which was Africa. You had three descendants of Noah, through which the rest of the human race came. Japhet were the Eurasians, Europeans and Asians. Okay. Ham was certain southern Arabians, but black Africans. They were Ham. And Shem, we get the Semites with the Jews, Arabs, and other such people. Okay. Everybody is a descendant of one of the three sons of Noah. Okay. There were people who were Hamo-Semitic. They were a kind of a combination of Semite and black African. But at a very early point after Noah, something happened according to history now. This is in the book of Jubilees. Canaan, a descendant of Ham, rebelled against his father, Ham, and his brothers. He fought against his family, opposed his family. And instead of going to the land God promised him, went to what would become Israel, calling it the land of Canaan. His father, Ham, Noah's son, and his brothers opposed this. Now you look at this. God has given the Eurasians, the sons of Japhet, much more land, much more people, and much more wealth than the Semites. He's given the Africans much more land, much more people, much more wealth. Africa is probably, in terms of natural resources, natural wealth, the wealthiest continent. Uranium, gold, diamonds. They've got almost everything. It's economically poor, but it's naturally rich. Among the sons of Shem, the Jews got very little. God gave the Arabs, the descendants of Ishmael and Esau, much more land, many more people, and much more wealth, even to this day with the oil and so forth. The Jews got very little land. They got very little wealth. God was going to magnify his strength and their weakness. He didn't want a great people or powerful people or wealthy people or massive people. He chose the insignificant, much the same as he chooses Christians. Consider your calling, my brethren. Not many of you are wealthy, powerful, etc. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. It was the same principle. Okay, so Canaan came to the land, and they became the Canaanites, and they became debaucherous. The curse that Noah placed was only on Canaan, who went against the black Africans, the other black Africans. He went against his father and his brothers. He went against them. Abraham was around from the time of the Canaanites. We're told when Abraham first came to the land, when God brought him there, that the Canaanite was in the land, already in the land. So Abraham was there for the time of the Canaanites, but the Canaanites were there early, very soon. But they should have been in Africa. They got into these debaucherous religions that we read about and we shall be studying in Torah, where you shall not do the things that the nations I'm driving out before you were doing. Bestiality, homosexuality, pedophilia, idolatry, things of this nature were the practices of the Canaanites. Joshua was to get rid of them and displace them. Now, let's look at this. How they could take that about a reprobate son of Ham, the founder of the black race, who went against Ham, went against his father and his brothers, and make that a justification for the subjection of blacks is theologically ridiculous. But to make it worse, what they would do, what they did do, the plantation owners of the American South, some were more benevolent than others, but some were downright cruel. What they did was they took the Greco-Roman pagan version of slavery, not the Hebraic one. God did not allow slavery among his people. He allowed indenturism, a kind of employment contract or a kind of temporary servitude if you were in debt to someone so they can reclaim their losses. Now, this is bound up with the teaching we have on our website on the year of Jubilees, Hashanah HaYovel. But after 6 years, on the 7th year, they were to go free. Much the same as a Hebrew could not permanently lose their land that had to be repatriated to the family. Going back to the apportionment of Joshua along tribal and family lines, because the land was the Lord's, the people were the Lord's. You can't enslave God's people. And if a pagan converted to Judaism, they'd be protected by the Torah. God did not allow slavery. He shall go as a free man on the 7th year without payment. He doesn't have to give you anything. He's free. It is indenturism. Slavery began in the United States, not only in the South. Slavery began in the South, but you had indenturism in the North. Under the Puritans, you had indentured servants in the North. If you read a book like The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, he goes into this. You had indenturism in the North, but indenturism became corrupted by greedy plantation owners with an economic motive who began twisting the scriptures to do what they did. There was to be no slavery. Now, what does the New Testament say? Look with me, please, to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Verse 21. Paul writes, "Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you're able also to become free, rather do that. If you can get free, become free." God did not agree with slavery. However, Paul was writing to the Greco-Roman world. Remember, 71 to 73 BC, there was 90 to 100,000 Roman slaves rebelled and followed Spartacus. Rome lived in fear of another uprising of the slaves, an armed uprising under Spartacus. The church was already being persecuted. If the church began propagating abolitionism in a pagan world, it would have provoked even further persecution. Paul's strategy, God's strategy, was to preach the gospel. And as more people would get saved, slavery would disappear of its own accord. But if you could get free, get free. God was always against it. Now, what else does the New Testament tell us? Slavery is a picture of something. If the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. We are all slaves. He who commits sin is slave to sin. But the Messiah comes and redeems us from slavery, buys us back with his blood. Slavery is the picture of the fallen nature of man in Scripture. God didn't want man fallen. That's why he didn't want slavery. He who commits sin is slave to sin. God was committed to set the captives free. He set the Hebrews free from Pharaoh, and he sets us free from sin. He was against it. He never wanted it. But you had these people, took indenturism and corrupted it along racial lines to line their own pockets. If he comes alone, he'll go out alone. If he's the husband of a wife, he shall go out with him. Then his wife will go out with him. He couldn't keep her either. But if his master gives him a wife, if he gets a wife from the owner and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and the children shall belong to the master. He shall not go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man. Notice, I love my master, my wife, and my children. He comes to the doorpost. Now, the lentils of the doorpost are where the blood of the lamb was applied, wasn't it? It's called mezuzot. We have a teaching called mezuzot, and Orthodox Jews will still have a Bible verse with the shin from the Shema on their doorpost. You drive it through the ear onto the doorpost in a ritual that usually took place at Passover when the Passover lamb was slain. I love my master, my wife, my child. I choose to remain a bondservant. I choose it myself. Contrary to Calvinism, and many of the proponents of slavery were Calvinists. There were anti-slavery Calvinists in England and in New England. But the Southern Baptists, the Southern Methodists, they were Calvinistic, as opposed to the followers of Wesley, who were all united in their opposition to slavery. Now let's understand this. God does not force people to become believers. He who commits sin is slave to sin. No, I don't want to be a slave to sin. I want to be redeemed. I want to be a bondservant of the Lord. I choose to follow Jesus Christ. And I want my family to do the same. My master, Bali, Jesus is Lord. My wife, my children. That's the way it goes. God, your wife, and kids. You're to choose it. God does not create some for heaven and some for hell. He foreknows the future, but he doesn't create people to go to hell. And he doesn't force people to become believers, as hyper-Calvinism teaches. You have to agree of your own volition to be a permanent bondservant of the master. And our master is, of course, Jesus. You, your wife, your children. I love my master. I love the Lord. I love my wife and my children, my family. I'm not going to go out as a free man. He set me free. Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. I'm no longer in bondage to sin and death. He set us free from that. But I choose to remain not a slave, but a bondservant. It's something I freely enter on my own cognizance and my own volition. The Lord draws us, but we must respond to his drawing. Now, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she's not to go free as the male slaves do. If she's displeased, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If she's displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, he shall let her be redeemed, bought back. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people. Even in the Old Testament, they were to avoid marriage to non-believers because of his unfairness to her. Notice, in God's eyes, you want to get rid of your wife? You're not being fair. Now, the New Testament, of course, does not allow divorce, except in the case of porneia. Now, if he designates her for his son, in other words, he takes this female slave as a wife for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. Your daughter-in-law is the same as your daughter. You must love her and treat her the same as you would your own biological daughter. You acquire her as a bride for your son. That's it. Now understand, Sarah called Abraham Lord, owner. The Hebrew word for master is Baal. The Hebrew word for husband is Baal. A wife is the husband's possession. The husband's the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. The church belongs to Jesus. It's his possession. And reflective of that, the wife belongs to the husband. Now, there were rules. In this bondservantship, you couldn't mistreat them. You knock their tooth out, they don't have to wait for the 7th year. They're free if you even knock their tooth out. They had the same Sabbath, Shabbat rest. They had the same days when they didn't have to work during the feast, the feasts, like Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They didn't have to work. They had, as it were, vacations, faith-based vacations, but they were vacations, much like the same somebody would go to a Bible camp for the vacation or a family Bible camp, family Bible holiday. They had the same rights. You couldn't mistreat them. You had to take care of them, and then they would go free. There would be no slavery, only bondservantship. Now, if he takes himself another woman, if he marries another one, now the New Testament, of course, says husband of one wife. It accepts the fact that there may be people becoming Christians that already have more than one wife. We've seen this in Africa. They get saved, but they've already had more than one wife. Well, what does that mean? Don't take any more, but you can't be a pastor or an elder or a deacon. Again, the New Testament, that means it, but accepts the reality of it. So many people were decimated in wars and famines and so forth, pestilences, that God allowed it under those circumstances. But let's look. If he takes another woman, he may not reduce her food or clothing or conjugal rights. You're not allowed to give less provision and less sustenance to the first wife because you've found another one. Neither are you allowed to show romantic or sexual favoritism to the second one at the expense of the first. You cannot love her any less, romantically, sexually, or otherwise, and you are to provide for her just the same. Now, by modern standards, we look at this differently, but by the standards of the ancient world, women did not have these rights in any other civilization that we know of. And slaves had none of these rights in any other civilization we know of. God did not allow slavery. If you will not do these 3 things for her, notice, food, clothing, and conjugal rights, romance, sex, then she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. You've treated her unfairly. Well, the slaves of the American South were bred in captivity. They divided families. They took a black man as a stud from the field, and they used him to impregnate black women to breed more slaves because the government would not allow them to buy them from Africa anymore, even before the Civil War. A black man was a stud. After he finished what he needed to do procreatively, put him back in chains in the field. Well, what happens now? What do these people do? They've replaced the black husband and father with a welfare check. Absentee father. the arrest rate, the imprisonment rate, the incarceration rate. Now, I know Donald Trump tried to redress some of this, but not again, I'm not making a political statement or stating fact. But the same thing. They're doing the same thing they always did. Using a black man as a stud, not as a father and a husband. Split up the families. That's what's going on. So not only did the plantation owners of the American South do this to blacks, by turning away from God, blacks do it to themselves. And not only blacks, but we're talking about slavery now. There was no 7th year for them to go free. You were a slave for life. You were born into slavery, you stayed a slave. That is completely contrary to the biblical theme and ethos dealing with the subject of freedom, of being set free from bondage. As Israel was set free from Pharaoh, as the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. As slavery being a figure in the Bible of being slave to sin. God always wanted redemption, buying the freedom, liberation. But the Southern plantation owners did not do that. They treated slaves as their possession instead of God's people. Well, they might have done that to slaves. They might have done that to blacks. They might have had the pagan Greco-Roman version of slavery instead of the biblical one, which was bondservantship. But they went to church every Sunday. They were religious hypocrites on top of it. This is not a new phenomenon. It happened in Old Testament Israel. Read the prophet Amos. They did the same thing, but they were religious about it. Yeah, they were religious about it. Well, that's the reality. Slavery is a figure of being enslaved to sin. God wants to set the captives free. Redeem the slave. Jesus is the Redeemer. The Goel in Hebrew. God did not allow slavery. He only allowed indenturism, bond servantship, a legal contract where the slaves had rights. Under the Torah, even animals had rights. Animal rights is not invented by the Green parties or these people who are vegetarian legalists in the modern sense. No, God said animals have rights. God said slaves have rights, including the right not to be a slave. You got to set them free on the 7th year, said God. Because it's a figure of the fact that we are all enslaved. But we have a Redeemer who freed us. Do not believe the lies being propagated today. This whole woke thing, it's revisionism. They're rewriting history. They're not telling you the truth about what really happened. On the other hand, understand that slavery has a deeper meaning than the injustice of owning another human being. Satan is our slave master until we come to a saving faith in Jesus who redeems us. We've all been slaves. Irrespective of our race, our skin color, our ethnicity, we have all been slaves with a cruel slave master. But we've been redeemed. And we have been redeemed by someone who we now voluntarily choose to be in permanent bondservantship to. The Son of Man came to serve. He came and died for us. He came and died for slaves, to set the slaves free. Now, we follow him. He wants it for you, for me, and if we read these verses, for our families. The first issue in the juridical portion of Torah that God addresses is the issue of slavery. Its ugliness, its injustice, and why God is against it. Why God was an abolitionist. Why? But let's remember, most importantly, he who commits sin is slave to sin. But if the Son sets us free, we shall be free indeed. Praise God, we have a Redeemer who took us from bondage. Let us all choose to be his bondservants, we and our families. He's a very, very benevolent Lord. What kind of a Lord would die for his servants? What kind of a master would die for his slaves? What kind of a Redeemer would do that? Only one. And that is the Lord Jesus. Thank you so much for listening. We'll continue, Lord willing, next week in this important chapter 21 of Exodus. God bless.
Hello, and thank you for watching Moriel TV. There are so many things that are happening at Moriel Ministries worldwide, from the Philippines to Japan, to India to Africa, and back to Europe and the United States. So many of our brothers and sisters are spreading the good news of Jesus Christ to this lost world. We are so thankful for your prayers. God has been faithful and has blessed us in so many ways. If you'd like to partner with our efforts abroad and at home, please take a moment to click the link in the description and help us as the Lord leads you. Thank you very much, and God bless.